If you're a .NET developer and you build websites, then you should be working with content security policies. Now, if you're not sure why or how, we don't really know the difference between CSP and CORS, then this is a must-watch video for you because I'm going to explain everything you need to do to lock your website down. Okay, so I'm going to start off just explaining what a CSP policy is and how we can implement one in .NET. So on the page, I've created a very basic template, and all this template is doing is calling in additional resources. So at the top, you can see here that we're using the link tag and we're calling in a style sheet. Underneath here, we've got an iframe, and I'm trying to iframe my own website. Underneath this, I'm trying to call in a third-party JS script, the Bootstrap one. And then underneath here, we need to display an image, and I'm displaying it from my external website. Now, if I go to my demo page that I've got loaded up, if I quickly minimize my dev tools, you'll see that my page isn't working at all. So I've got an iframe, got an error, you can see the image here isn't loading. And if I look at my console, we're going to see a bunch of different errors here. So we can see that, yep, the image isn't loading because it violates a content security policy. We can see my style sheet. Again, it's violating the content security policy, the same as my script. So the URL isn't working because of content security policy. And you can see my iframe, you guessed it, it's also being blocked because of a content security policy. Now, this is obviously a very extreme example because I basically made it so my website can't access any resource whatsoever. However, hopefully you can see that whenever you're building a website, you should be adding content security policies because it's really going to level up your security. Now, the next thing to talk about is in .NET, where do we add these policies? And you'll probably guess it's in program.cs. So if I go into Mass Solution Explorer, program.cs that you can hopefully see, what we're going to do is add in a bit of config and define some rules. So in order to add in your CSP policies, you're going to do an app.use, and you can see here we've got a context response header. So basically we're going to add in a bunch of stuff within the request header to basically say what's allowed and what's not allowed on the page. Now I'll cover all these different directives in a minute, but actually a content security policy is made up of around 10 to 12 different directives, and you can pick which directives you want to implement on your site. Now on the right hand side here, you can see that I've put in a value of none for everything. And this is the reason why I'm not allowed to access any single resource within my web page. So I've jumped us over to the developer mozilla.org docs. And if we go to content security, let's have a look at how we can define it. Now, as we've seen, the policy is made up of two parts. First, you define a directive, and then you put in the value of how you want to restrict that resource. Now, in terms of directives, we have a few different things. Now, I'm not going to cover every single fetch directive here because there's about 30 or 40, but I'll quickly highlight what I think are some of the main ones that you'll probably be using on a regular basis. So we've got the child source, which can be used for iframes, the connect one, which I think is very interesting because this is going to define the domains that you can use in script execution. So let's think we're making a fetch request in a JavaScript script. Which domain can we access? Now, this is very easy to get confused with CORS because you can get CORS issues again from calling resources on an API, but we'll cover CORS later. Now, one that you'll probably add into every single CSP policy that you need to set up is the default one. So this is going to be the fallback if you don't specify every single 40 directives. Let's be honest, you're not going to. Now, underneath here, you can see that we've got the ability to restrict the domains which call fonts, iframes, images, manifest files, media, so audio and video. We've got our object restrictions, prefetch, scripts, so which JavaScript files can we call from what domains. We've got style, so which style sheets can we call with which domains, and then we've got a worker. Now, aside from the default ones, we've got some document ones. So we've got a base URI, we've got a sandbox, we've got some navigation ones, so form actions and frame ancestors. So what can actually communicate through your iframes. We've got some reporting ones. There's a bunch of other ones, like a required trust types for whatever. And you can see we've got a bunch of deprecated ones as well. So that definitely was a very long list, but that's really good because it's going to give you very fine-grained control over what resources are allowed to be used on your web pages, and more importantly, what domains are allowed to use each type of resource, because in terms of security, that's very important. So the directives are one part, and then the next bit is we need to say what can actually access each type of resource. Okay, so I've jumped us back over to my program.cs. I've slightly tweaked my CSP policies, so we can now start to look at values in anger. Now, you'll hopefully notice straight away that the first thing we can see here is I've changed none to self. And self, you can probably guess what this means. It means that a resource can access a resource on the same domain that's been loaded from. Now, for a lot of examples, you'll probably want to whitelist one or more domains. And the way that we can whitelist things is that after self, we've got a space. You can see that we put in our domain we want to whitelist. And then after this, we need to put this unsafe dash in line. And you can see that for each directive I've got, at the end, I've got my semicolon to denote that this directive is finished, and then we can add in the next one. With those rules set up, if we go back to our original page, you can see that the iframe is now unblocked, and you can see the image is now loading. And if we look inside our console, what we'll notice is that all the stack path stuff, it's still being blocked with our content security policy rule because we haven't whitelisted this domain. Now, another thing that's probably worth pointing out is that because I'm using an iframe, you also need to think about the resources that the iframe is accessing as well. Now, for this example, you can see that I'm getting a script execution error here, and the page itself, it's not doing anything at all. However, the underlining page in my iframe, it's also calling resources. So potentially, when you're setting up your iframe, you're also going to have to unblock things, maybe using the frame ancestor directive or the script execution directive. Now, if we quickly go back to thinking around configuration, we've seen none and self. Let's quickly look at some of the other values that you can use against your directives. So none, nothing's going to load. Self is only resources from the current origin. We've got strict dynamic, where the trust is granted to a script in the page due to an accompanying nonce. So nonce, I mean, it's not the best word in the world. However, just if you need to do some security, you can add in an extra hash to make sure that the rules are okay. We've also got report sample, we've got inline speculation rules, and then we've also got a bunch of keywords that we can use. So we've looked at the unsafe inline, so we use that for whitelisting things. We've also got unsafe eval, used for whitelisting dynamic code evaluations. We've got unsafe hashes and WASM, unsafe eval. Now, when it comes to whitelisting hosters, you can see here that you can pretty much press in any sort of combination of URL that you want. So you can just press in your domain, you can put in subdomains with a wildcard, and you can also press in the suffix here of your HTTP or your HTTPS. So once you kind of combine all of these together with all your directives, you're going to have a pretty watertight way of locking down your site. So that covered the two parts of setting up a CSP policy. We now hopefully understand the resources we can target and how we can either lock them down or elevate access. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is development, because if you're trying to set up a demo, maybe you're trying to do some local debugging on a site with CSP policies, a lot of the time your requests will get blocked. Now, the good news is that using a proxying tool locally, you can actually get rid of some of the CSP policies, and sometimes this is going to allow you to do more stuff locally. So now let's quickly jump to Chrome and I'll show you how to set this up. Now on the screen, you can see a demo site that I've been working with. And one of the issues I've got on this site, you can see it right here, is this image is failing to load. Now, if I do an inspect, and if I look within my network sources, refresh it quickly, you can see that we've got these failed images. And the error here is strict origin when cross origin error. Now, additionally, we've also got some stuff within the console. So we've got some violations, and this is what a CSP policy error might look like. Now, in order to start unblocking some of these just locally, what we can do is intercept the Chrome browser requests and then remove certain headers. And basically, we do this using a proxy tool. Now, the proxy tool that I like using, it's free. it's in Chrome only and it's called Requestly. So come over, download Requestly. Now, after you install Requestly, within your taskbar, you're going to get this little icon. And then if I load it up here, you can see that I've got a remove content security policy rule. Now, if I enable my rule again, if I go back to my website, if I refresh the page, you can see that my image is now displaying for local development purposes only. Now, this rule obviously is not going to affect every website in the world. However, it does unblock me in this instance. Also, if I go back to my console, hopefully we'll see I've now got a lot less errors compared to before. Now, if you're interested in what rule we need to set up, if I click on my rule in Requestly, we can see that we've got this remove content security policy. And if I zoom over to the portal here, you can see that what I've done is saying that if the URL contains that website that we're looking at, what I want to do with the request headers is remove the content-security-policy. I'm also going to remove allow scripts, and I'm also going to remove the referrer policy. So by simply removing some of these headers within the browser by using a proxy tool, sometimes you can actually do local debugging and it works a treat. So a CSP policy is going to define exactly what resources your website can talk to and via what origin. Now, one resource your website might try and access is an API. And if it's your own local API, then using the script execution directive is going to allow that website to talk to that API. Now, one thing where some people might get confused is that when you're setting up API, sometimes you might need to enable a CORS policy. So CSP and CORS, they kind of have a slight overlap. However, they're created for very different intentions. So now let's look at how we can set up CORS in .NET and then compare it to a CSP policy. Now within .NET, in order to enable CORS, you're going to be going to your program.cs again. However, for CORS, we're going to need to register 2 bits of code. So first off, in our services, we're going to have to do something which looks a bit like this. So we've got services, add CORS, and then we can add a policy. We can add our policy name, and then you can put it in your rules. So just for testing, just for this, I've actually created a rule which is going to block local host access. And if I scroll further down, you'll see that I've registered our CORS policy by doing app.useCORS and then passing in my policy name. Now, for this example, I'm going to be testing things against an endpoint. So right down the bottom of my program.cs, you can see I've mapped a get. My URL is API/CSP. And then if things have gone okay, you can see here I should be returning hello world. Now, the other thing, and another way you can attach different CORS policies to endpoints, you can see here I've got a dot with metadata. You can see I've got my enable CORS attribute. And again, I'm passing in my rule here. However, really, I don't need this. I thought it might be good for learning. Now, in order for me to demonstrate this point, I need to create a second app. So I've created a very basic HTML page. In it, I've got some JavaScript, which is going to ping our API. Now, just for me to do examples, you can see I've got this referrer in here. So I'm not using localhost, so I can just trigger an error. And then underneath here, if the request is okay, we're going to get yes in the console, otherwise no. Now, in order to launch this website, I'm using a tool called Live Server. So I've launched it and you can see my page is running on port 5500. So I've loaded the page and you can see, unsurprisingly, that my request has been blocked. So this time my access to my API has been blocked by the CORS policy that we've set up. The request header field referrer is not allowed by access control allow headers in the pre-flight response. No, nothing's happening here. Now, one key thing to understanding CORS is the pre-flight. So if I refresh the page now, what you'll see is we've got the CSP pre-flight. And this, you can see, is a request method of options. So basically what happens with CORS is that when you make a request, a pre-flight check is going to be made. That's going to be sent to the API. The API and the server is going to get your request. It's going to figure out the CORS options and it's going to send the CORS options back to the browser. Now, what will happen is that if we look within my network requests, you'll see that I've got a call to my CSP here, and now it's blocked. And this mechanism is how a website and server communicate to figure out what resources the CORS policy will allow and not allow. So that covers how to set up CORS. And I think the next thing which will be useful to go over is actually what happens when we start enabling CSP policies and CORS. Because if you still have confusion, I think when you see a real world example, it's going to make things much clearer. We're now back inside my program.cs. I've uncommented my content security policy header. And the important thing I need to point out here is that I've set my script execution, so connect-src, and I've set it to none. Now, at the same time, I've also updated my CORS policy. So I've created a brand new policy and it's called allow example. And you can see here with origin 127.0.0.1.500 or 5,500 even. And you can see I've got allow any method, allow any header with exposed headers content disposition. And then finally, I've updated my API at the bottom to use this new policy. Now, if I launch my site, what you'll see is that on my page, I'm getting a content security policy error because localhost, blah, 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 API CSP is violating my connect source equals none. Now, the reason why I was getting this error, because on the page itself, I've copied the script tag line for line. You can see here that I'm making a fetch request. Now, because we've got that script execution, you can see that we've got an error rather than the console printing out yes. So now if we jump back to our demo site, if we look in the console, you can see there's no errors whatsoever. If I look at network, if I look at my requests, you'll see the CSP returns everything okay. And I personally think the big thing to understand is that you should be implementing a CSP policy on every single website that you create because it's going to define what resources your website can access. And for us .NET developers, there's really no excuse for not implementing a CSP on every website you build because you can start with these 4 lines of code. To start with the default SRC, set it to self, and then as you bump into blockers and test things, simply just modify the policy to whitelist things as needed. Now, CORS on the other hand, CORS is optional. And we can think of it as maybe a mechanism of kind of slightly lowering security. So if you're building an API and you just want your website to talk to your API, you don't need to worry about CORS whatsoever because out of the box, things can get blocked. The only reason why you need to add CORS is because you want a third party to access your API. And this is where you put in your CORS policy. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about it. So that covered CORS and CSP. And kind of let me know in the comments if you were a little bit confused between the two, because I was at first. Now we've got to the stage where if you have liked this video, don't forget to gently click on that subscribe button and like, because I do weekly content which will make you a better developer that you won't want to miss out on. Now, if you do want to learn a little bit more about .NET, then I've created a video all about the best .NET NuGet packages in the world right now. So the link to that is on screen. Check that out because it's a banger. Otherwise, until my next video, happy coding.